The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Tom Stanton from the National Regulatory Research Institute. Welcome to today's webinar entitled Practical Protocols for Utility Pilot Projects. I want to welcome you to the call. I see many staff members from around the country. We had registrations from 28 states, and I see several commissioners on the call. Thank you for joining us today. We are about ready to get started, and I will introduce our moderator for today. That is Michigan Commissioner Tremaine Phillips. Tremaine was appointed to the Michigan Public Service Commission by our Governor Gretchen Whitmer in September 2019 for a term that expires July 2025. And prior to this appointment, Commissioner Phillips was working in both the public sector and private sector to accelerate the nation's transition to clean, renewable, and reliable energy resources. Most recently, he served as director of the Cincinnati 2030 district, leading that organization to become one of the most engaged and largest 2030 districts in the country. If you don't already know about 2030 districts, I invite you to go Google that after today's webinar and take a look. It's, to me, a very interesting program going on in many cities around North America. Prior to that, he worked for one energy strategic initiatives company named Empower Saves, and he was named as one of the emerging clean energy leaders through the Midwest Energy News 40 Under 40 Award. Prior to that, worked on the Clean Power Plan for the Obama administration when he was an intern at the White House Council on Environmental Quality. He serves on several different committees for the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners and represents the Public Service Commission on Governor Whitmer's Michigan Poverty Task Force. In February 2020, he was appointed to serve on the NRRI Broadband Expansion Task Force. So we certainly welcome Commissioner Phillips to join us today and moderate this session. If you'll go to the next slide, please, Elliot. Here's our housekeeping reminder for everyone. All during this session, anytime that you have a question, please type it into the questions tab on your GoToMeeting control panel. If there are clarifying questions, we will ask them right away after each presenter, and then we'll hold general discussion topics and questions until the end, after all the presenters have finished. The slide decks were also attached to the email that you received, and they'll be shown one after another as we run through this webinar. So again, thank you all for joining us, and I'm going to turn it over to Commissioner Phillips. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom, and I just want to check one more time. You can hear me okay?
Yes, volume is great. Thank you.
All right, perfect. Well, thank you, everyone, for participating in this webinar this afternoon. Tom failed to mention that we have worked together for almost 20 years here, and he has been a mentor of mine and certainly has assisted us at the Commission, as well as myself personally, on a number of important energy issues, particularly in the arena of renewable energy. Particularly just want to say thank you for participating with us at this time. As many of you know, Michigan has really been marred by the impacts of COVID-19, and we certainly at the Commission have been dealing on an hourly basis with the impacts related to this public health crisis. But it feels very good to kind of be in the plateau stage, at least we think, in regards to the infections here in the state, and to now be able to look forward and to participate in some conversations and discussions that are, again, more on the vanguard for forward thinking. And I think this discussion regarding utility pilots certainly fits that bill. So I want to introduce our speakers here up front. And before I do that, just help you all better understand the interest of this topic for the Michigan Public Service Commission and for myself. recently, in October of 2019, the Michigan Public Service Commission launched what we call the My Power Grid initiative. This is a customer-focused, multi-year stakeholder effort established by the Governor Whitmer administration in collaboration with the commission, really focused on maximizing the benefits of the transition to clean and distributed energy here in the state of Michigan for residents as well as for business customers. In Michigan, between 2015 and 2025, we will be decommissioning around 50% of our coal capacity, and there will be other coal retirements after that date. Additionally, over the next several years, we will be decommissioning about 20% of our nuclear capacity. A lot of that is being backfilled by renewables as well as one gas project in particular. But given that transition, we wanted to be better prepared from the acceptance of new technologies, from the analyzing of new business models, and looking at new regulatory models, better prepared for how we engage in this transition and really look at what the impacts are for customers as a whole, as well as particular customer classes in the state. I don't think that we should make the assumption that increased deployment and increased adoption of renewable energy or time-based pricing and some of these other initiatives are going to benefit all customers in the state equally. So we, in the My Power Grid effort, it's divided up into three components, and those three components have 11 different subsections of the effort. One bucket that I am leading is on customer engagement. The other area, which our chair, Sally Talberg, is leading, is on integrating emerging technologies. And then the third bucket, which our Commissioner Scripps is leading, is on optimizing grid performance and investments. In that customer engagement section, we have one of those subgroups that's really around utility and energy pilot programs. How do we better analyze those programs on the front end, and how do we better give direction to regulated utilities on what types and what models of energy and technology pilots the Commission is really looking for as we try and facilitate this transition. Dr. Joy Wang, who I will introduce, is leading that effort, and I will certainly let her in her presentation talk a little bit more about that Energy Pilots Committee and what they are doing as it relates to the My Power Grid effort. So I'm just very happy to be here moderating for the panel today. Again, I hope everyone is staying at home, but also is safe and well this afternoon, and I thank you once again for participating. So first I'll introduce Dr. Joy Wang. She is a public utilities engineer in the smart grid section here at the Michigan Public Service Commission. Dr. Wang received her BS and MS degrees from Michigan State University, majoring in biosystems engineering. She also earned her PhD in public policy, focusing on energy and environmental policy from the Georgia Institute of Technology. Prior to her current position at the MPSC, Joy worked at the Michigan Energy Office and as an engineer engaged in sustainability consulting. Next up on our panel is Jake Marin. He is a staff attorney at the Vermont Public Utility Commission. Mr. Marin serves as an advisor to commissioners as well as a hearing officer in commission proceedings. His work is focused on the electricity sector, particularly renewable energy programs, and Mr. Marin has worked at the Vermont Public Utility Commission for 9 years. Lastly, we have Peter Capers, a research scientist at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. He conducted his research for 18 years in the areas of demand response and electric utility regulatory and business model issues. At present, he leads the LBNL's demand response and smart grid subteam, and with those team members has been able to perform a tremendous amount of research over the last 5 years on residential customer acceptance and response to time-based rates and programs. Mr. Capers received a BA in 1997 from Syracuse University, and that degree was in mathematics and economics, and an MS in 2005 from Cornell University in applied economics. So thank you all again for agreeing to participate in this webinar this afternoon. So to kick things off, I will pass it over to my talented and esteemed colleague, Dr. Joy Wang.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Phillips. Once again, my name is Joy Wang, and I am an engineer at the Commission in Michigan. And I'm happy to speak with you today about the Michigan Public Service Commission's case review and utility survey. So this work, next slide, please. This work was conducted under the Energy Programs and Technology Pilots work group that Commissioner Phillips shared with you guys. So I'll provide a brief overview of that work group before moving on to discuss the results of our MPSC case review and the utility survey that we conducted. We'll cover some of the review findings and some of the questions that staff had afterwards. Next slide, please. The Energy Programs and Technology Pilots work group is within the My Power Grid initiative that Commissioner Phillips provided the overview for. Commissioner Phillips is the lead commissioner, and we have a sponsor who is Ann Armstrong-Cusack. She is the director of our Customer Assistance Division. I'm the staff lead, and we have over 30 staff members who are participating in this work group. The Commission has tasked us to engage with utilities and stakeholders to investigate past Commission-approved pilots and to also understand the outcomes and apply the lessons learned from existing pilot projects, where to identify the pilot best practices, and then to propose objective criteria that can be used to evaluate proposed utility pilot projects in the future. Due to two of these tasks, we conducted the MPSC case review and the utility survey. Next slide, please. So the MPSC case review, I'll first provide our results from that. We were hoping to review the approved pilots, and due to the long history of pilots at the Commission, we constrained it to 2008 to 2019. And 2008 seemed like a good starting point because that was the year that Michigan passed the Clean and Renewable Energy and Energy Waste Reduction Act. So we had some new energy legislation. However, for this review, we did choose to exclude energy waste reduction pilots. Many of you guys may know energy waste reduction as energy efficiency. We had a total of 14 staff members who helped review these cases, and we reviewed information that was available in our e-docket system. So we have an online system with our dockets available and all of the filings that have been filed so far. So staff reviewed the Commission order, the company and staff testimony, and any filed reports if they were available. Next slide, please. In total, we identified 155 cases that mentioned pilots, and of those cases, 76 of them had unique pilots. And because a few of them had multiple pilots that were mentioned, we had a total of 85 unique pilots that staff reviewed. Those pilots came from 4 investor-owned utilities. Consumers Energy had 51% of the pilots reviewed, DTE had 42%, and the Upper Peninsula Power Company and Indiana and Michigan Power had single-digit representation. Next slide, please. We found that the pilots examined a variety of issues and questions. The most popular one was technology implementation pilots. We found that 32% of the pilots we reviewed pertained to technology implementation. 26% of them pertained to customer service, and 20% pertained to billing and payment issues. And you can see a variety of other topics that staff compiled information for. Next slide, please. So when we break down the technology pilot bucket a little bit more, we see that 20% of those pilots pertain to renewable energy. This was followed by 6% pertaining to electric vehicles, and 5% of them were in this other technology bucket that didn't fit into any of the other categories listed here. Next slide, please. Staff found that pilot design information wasn't ubiquitous in the cases that we we reviewed. 34% of the pilots that we located did not have any clear goals or concepts that were relayed, or any justification or need for the pilot that was relayed. 24% of them provided sample size information, and only 16% provided information on how participants would be selected. Next slide, please. Evaluation criteria was also many times missing. Only 16% of the pilots we reviewed provided any information on how the pilot would be evaluated after completion, and only 13% detailed any criteria with which success would actually be evaluated. Next slide, please. We also found that required reporting was limited. Only 20% of the pilots we reviewed actually required reporting, and only 14% actually had reports filed to the docket. Guidance was also limited. Only 12% of the pilots had any guidance from the commission or staff on best practices or pilot goals. Next slide, please. This table kind of breaks down that guidance issue a little bit more, and you can see that guidance was provided for consumers energy and DTE pilots. And in those cases, the commission provided guidance for 12% of consumers energy pilots and 14% of DTE's pilots. Staff provided guidance for 9% of consumers energy's pilots and 17% of DTE's pilots. And in terms of consumers energy, there was coinciding guidance provided for those pilots in all instances where staff provided guidance. But for DTE, the commission provided guidance only on half of the times that staff provided guidance. So when we contrast these results with the commission's own motion, which you can see on the bottom row, staff reviewed 12 instances of the commission's own motions that mentioned pilots, and the commission provided guidance in half of those. Staff provided guidance in 5 cases, and in all of those cases, the commission also provided guidance. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, staff found that there is really limited information regarding pilot design, success criteria, and evaluation methods about the pilots currently filed in the dockets. The word pilot is also really loosely applied in these materials, so staff actually had a challenging time in some cases determining whether the pilot was actually a pilot. In some cases, it sounded like they were referring to a permanent program where they would actually talk about it as if it was a permanent program, but the title would refer to it as a pilot. So defining what constitutes a pilot in Michigan may be advisable, and it's something that the work group is exploring as we move forward. We also found that the staff and commission do not often provide guidance regarding pilot goals or best practices, but the commission guidance is more likely in its own motion. So we found that the likelihood was 50% versus 12%. And even though there is a large variety of pilot issues and topics that were explored, technology implementation pilots seem to be the most popular. Next, I'll discuss our utility survey that staff conducted. We drafted a survey about utility pilots for the same time period from 2008 to 2019. And this survey also asked questions about energy waste reduction pilots or energy efficiency pilots, which we excluded from our MPSC case review. We sent the survey to electric investor-owned utilities in Michigan, and we received responses back earlier this year. And I just want to know that these responses are independent of the staff case review that I just discussed. Next slide, please. So this chart shows some of the responses that we received. We received a total of 4 responses, and of those, only 3 companies actually had pilots during the period that we requested. Once again, Consumers Energy and DTE represented the majority of these pilots. And you can see that a significant portion of the pilots they reported also had an energy waste component. So for Consumers Energy, that was 47% of their pilots. For DTE, that was 35% of their pilots that had some type of energy waste reduction or energy efficiency component. In total, we had 95 pilots that were reported and that staff analyzed. Next, please. Once again, we found that technology pilots were the most popular topic, but in this case, they were the bulk of the topics that were mentioned in these survey results. So 93% of the pilots in the responses pertain to technology implementation. 24% pertain to customer service, education, or behavior, and 11% pertain to billing or payment or time of use. And so some of these pilots were classified in more than one category. So if you add the percentages up, they exceed 100, just so you know. Next slide, please. And when we look at the technology pilots in greater detail, we see that 39% of those were pertaining to energy waste reduction. So that was a large percentage of those technology pilots. And this was followed by the 16% in kind of other technologies, which is the mishmash of technologies that are otherwise listed on this chart. Energy storage was 13% of these pilots, followed by 11% for both renewable energy and electric vehicle pilots. Next, please. We found that 12% of the pilots tested multiple technologies. Next, please. And that 35% of the pilots actually led to a permanent program. So over 35%, nearly 36%. About 31% of the pilots did not result in a permanent program. And this other category, which we had about 7%, were due to a variety of issues, but one of them was instances where the pilot did not lead to a permanent program, but it might have led to a revision to the existing pilot or development of a new pilot to explore another issue more deeply. Next page. We learned that the utilities reported that the pilots have required reporting for the majority of their pilots. Consumers Energy reported that 66% of their pilots had required reporting. DTE said that 77% of their pilots had required reporting. Next, please. So even though the utilities reported that the majority of their pilots had required reporting, staff found in the case review that there was a lower incidence of required reporting and even fewer reports that were actually filed to the dockets. So this suggests to us that maybe some of this utility reporting is more informal reporting, where the utilities might come in to discuss the pilots with staff or stakeholders and make presentations, but not necessarily file anything formal, like a formal report to the docket. However, we do have some caution on this finding in that, we did exclude energy waste reduction pilots from our case review, so the results should be tempered by that. The EWR pilots do have a requirement to report back every year, so that might be one reason why there's such a discrepancy in the between the utility survey and the MPSC case review on this topic. We found that nearly 36% of pilots yielded a permanent program. However, staff would like to learn more about how the learnings from pilots that did not yield a permanent program were used. And we found that the majority of the pilots seemed to be focused on some type of technology implementation, since they were over 92%, nearly 93% of the total pilots. So staff had a number of questions that were prompted by this review and the survey. The first one is, should we define pilots more clearly in Michigan? In some jurisdictions, they do have different definitions for what is a pilot versus a demonstration project. So that's something that we'd like to explore further. And should pilot reporting be required and formalized, since there is a discrepancy in what is formally reported and available in e-dockets? And in a similar vein, should the pilot results or data be reported and made available? Because currently that information is not readily accessible, even though the utilities may have come in to talk with staff or stakeholders and presented some preliminary data in a presentation slide. It's not formally documented in a way that the general public or other interested people could pull up through e-dockets or in another fashion. And how can this pilot data be used to greatest effect if it is available? Can we share information about pilots across entities where maybe one utility can learn from another utilities pilot without having to do a similar pilot or the same pilot. And staff wanted to have a better understanding of the utilities' current pilot processes. You know, we had about 31% of the pilots that did not yield the permanent program. So what happens in those cases and how are those learnings used? What type of pilot design and evaluation information should be required? Because we found that to be lacking in our review and in the survey results. And lastly, you know, should the commission provide more uniform guidance on pilots, since we don't have a lot of guidance currently on specific pilots? And how should that guidance vary depending on the pilot's characteristics, you know, what the size, the type, or the nature of the pilot? So thank you very much for your time. I'm happy to entertain any questions.
Dr. Wong, we did get one question from the audience, and I want to give you a chance to answer that. An audience member wanted us to confirm, was this only about Michigan cases and Michigan utilities?
Yes, this was only for cases in the MPSC dockets for our case review. And
the survey was only of Michigan investor-owned utilities, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Electric investor-owned utilities.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Dr. Wong. And I think if we don't have any other immediate questions, we will go ahead to Mr. Marin.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Phillips. My name is Jake Marin. I'm from the Vermont Public Utility Commission. We can go to my first slide. All right. If there's one message that the commission, the Vermont Commission, wanted me to convey to the participants today is that Vermont really supports innovation by its investor-owned utility, Green Mountain Power, mostly because we have two significant sets of policy goals in Vermont related to greenhouse gas emissions reductions and so-called energy transformation. Vermont has a goal of reducing its greenhouse gas emissions by 75% by 2050. Vermont utilities also have a statutory requirement to transform their fossil fuel use of their customers into electric use to reduce emissions. And so, you know, my graphic there sort of shows a very stereotypical example of that, and that would be converting customers who heat with oil to a cold climate heat pump so that we can avoid those greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide, please. As you can see from this pie chart, the task of reducing emissions is a challenge for the commission because the electric sector represents a very small portion of Vermont's greenhouse gas emissions. We only have a very small number of fossil fuel generators in the state. The vast majority of in-state generation is renewable, and we procure, or Green Mountain Power procures, a significant amount of power from out of state that is non-fossil fuel based. Next slide, please. So a little bit of information about Green Mountain Power Corporation. They're the state's only investor-owned utility. They're also our largest utility. They serve over 265,000 customers, and that's over 70% of the state's electric load. They're a vertically integrated company, so they own generation, and the current requirements for pilots by Green Mountain Power were set in case number 18-1633-PET. I'm sorry for the typo on this slide. That should be 18-1633-PET, where the commission approved a multi-year regulation plan for Green Mountain Power. The multi-year regulation plan fixes a significant portion of Green Mountain Power's rates for a period of 3 years, and it also sets requirements for pilots, among other activities of the utility. And so there are a couple key features for GMP's pilot programs that were established in this docket. The first of which is that pilots have to be designed to be energy transformation projects. They need to be intended to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and the commission, really wants the utility to use its potential for innovation to drive those policies. And so that's why we're hoping that traditional utility business models and traditional regulatory models aren't standing in the way of the state meeting these important policy goals. We do have some guardrails that are baked into the multi-year regulation plan to keep the pilots a focused learning exercise and protect ratepayers at the same time. So spending on GMP's pilots is limited to $5 million a year. They can exceed that limit if they apply for a specific approval from the commission. Also, the rate treatment of capital spending from GMP's pilots, it is only allowed into rates where the pilots are forecasted to contribute a net positive benefit to non-participating customers. So, an example of this is that the company is testing out a technology that's going to, reduce its peak expenses. And so those costs are going to be shared amongst all of the company's ratepayers. Pilots are also limited to a duration of 18 months. And as you'll see in some of the next slides, the hope is that they are advanced to tariffed offerings, or if they are terminated, that we've learned something. So this slide shows an outline of the process that a pilot goes through, sort of its cradle to grave. GMP is developing these pilot ideas. That development is supposed to happen in consultation with a couple of entities. I'm going to describe the entities on a future slide, but the goal here is to make sure that GMP isn't unilaterally picking sort of technologies or services to offer, that it's consulting with other providers of these technologies and services in the state, and where appropriate, developing comparable offerings that companies other than GMP can participate in with access to GMP's system. Once a pilot is developed, there's notice to the commission 15 days before the pilot begins. It's an information filing. The commission does use that opportunity sometimes to ask questions. Stakeholders have also used that 15-day period sometimes to file comments with the commission, but the pilot can go into effect after those 15 days. During the 18-month pilot program, there are reporting requirements that I'm going to describe on a future slide. They happen every 6 months, and then also a final report at the end of the pilot. And at the end of the pilot, it is the commission's hope that the service or product is advanced to a tariffed offering, but if it is terminated, that lessons are learned and reported to the commission. So we can go to the next slide. As part of the docket where the multi-year regulation plan was approved, GMP entered into a memorandum of understanding with several stakeholders about how it would consult in developing its pilot programs. The GMP is required to consult with an entity called Renewable Energy Vermont. They're a trade association of developers and service providers for renewable energy and other energy services in Vermont. The links on this slide can take you to their website. And also in Vermont, we have appointed an entity, Vermont Energy Investment Corporation, to run Vermont's efficiency program, Efficiency Vermont. And so they are an efficiency utility. They also are trying to reduce fossil fuel use in the state and also reduce overall electric consumption. So consultation in developing these the pilots, I think, is really important to make sure that the relevant stakeholders are working in concert and not at odds with each other. And as a result of the MOU that Green Mountain Power entered into with Renewable Energy Vermont, that's where this requirement that GMP would offer comparable third-party offerings through its pilot programs. An example of this would be its Bring Your Own Device pilot. And I'll talk a little bit more about the Bring Your Own Device pilot on a future slide. So we can move to the next slide. So the utility is required to report every 6 months during the course of its pilot. I won't read all these bullets to you, but some of the data that we ask for is quantitative in nature. The Department of Public Service, which is the state's energy office, and also the public advocate, developed a lot of these data reporting requirements to better understand how the pilots affect the company's financial position, as well as its ability to control its load. Some of the other reporting requirements are more qualitative, asking about lessons learned, and also getting information from the utility about whether it will be advancing the tariff to advancing the pilot to a tariff, or if it is going to be terminating the pilot, why is it doing it? And the Department of Public Service and GMP also agreed on a sample reporting form. So these reports come to the commission on a standard sort of template, which I appreciate. It makes them much more easy to read and a little bit easier to sort of get a sense of how the pilot is progressing or how it went when it comes to reading a final report. And the link at the bottom of the slide should take you to a sample of the reporting form. I will note that for some of the documents that are linked to my presentation, you will have to create an account in EPUC, the Commission's online document management system, if you want to look at the documents. So thank you for doing that if you like to. Next slide, please. So these are just a scattering of some of the recent pilots that GMP has conducted in Vermont. The first one is the energy storage system pilot. This was a pilot where GMP installed batteries that it owns in customers' homes. The customers were able to access those batteries for reliability purposes. So if there was an outage, the customer would be able to, ride through that outage using a Tesla Powerwall. And the company, GMP, was able to access those batteries to try to target peak events. And those savings from those peak events are shared with all customers on the system. That was a well-subscribed pilot. There were a lot of participants, and it's been advanced to a tariff. It's under review in a current case before the commission right now, so I can't talk about the tariff, but it was a good example of a pilot that successfully has moved on to be a proposed tariff. The Bring Your Own Device pilot was the third-party comparable tariff to the energy storage system pilot. It started off as a pilot where a certain number of technologies could participate, not just batteries, but EV chargers, controllable water heaters, where these are customer-owned devices that were installed by a third party, and the company, GMP, would pay those customers for the benefits that it derived from having access to those devices. It was advanced as a Bring Your Own Device tariff that's also currently under review at the commission. I will note that the tariff was limited to batteries. So, in conducting the pilot, the company determined that it maybe wasn't ready to have a tariff service for EV chargers or water heaters, or that they wanted to have a different tariff. And so those parts of the pilots didn't come through to the tariff that's under review right now. The third example I have was a financing pilot where GMP partnered with a local credit union to provide financing for cold climate heat pumps for its customers. At the end of the pilot, GMP determined that while there were benefits that accrued to its system from doing the pilot, they didn't really justify GMP's participation in the market, which was very mature, and they didn't feel like they needed to advance this to a tariff because there were plenty of providers out there lending for cold climate heat pumps. And then the final example that I wanted to talk about today was the Connect to DER pilot. GMP had a device that it could plug right into a customer's electric socket that eased the interconnection of photovoltaic net metering systems. However, after conducting the pilot, GMP discovered that the device was not compatible with if you wanted to add a battery storage to that system later. It wasn't going to work well, and also that the overall financial benefits of the pilot didn't really justify the program. So they terminated the pilot and did not advance it to a tariff. And I've included links here for documents about all of these pilots. You can read the final reports if you'd like. Next slide, please. In conclusion, I just wanted to say that the Vermont Commission thinks that it's very important to allow its investor-owned utility the opportunity to try to develop these creative solutions to some of the energy policies that the state is seeking to implement. And we're very thankful to Tom Stanton and NRRI for letting us participate in this workshop, because it will help us, I think, improve our offerings of pilots in the future in Vermont. So thank you very much, and I'll take any questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Jake. We did have a few clarifying questions come in, so let's try to handle those right away if we can. See, the first one says, if a pilot program does include some spending, then this person thought maybe it sounds more like a permanent program or something beyond a pilot. Are there additional considerations about that capital investment? Does the pilot program, in quotes, need any kind of a high expectation of success before it becomes a permanent infrastructure?
That's a great question, and I think that there is some of that consideration baked into our process. Like I said, in order for capital spending from a pilot to be included in rates, there does need to be a basis for the company thinking that the pilot is going to provide net benefits to its customers. And so that would be a question that would come up in a rate case. I think that the commission does look very hard to make sure that when the company is pursuing a pilot, that there is that it's being implemented in a manner that's reasonably likely to generate benefits.
Okay, great. And maybe this is a related question. Someone's asking, it sounds like the pilots do not require commission approval or just a notice to the commission. Is that correct? Or could the commission disapprove one of these pilots?
So it is true that the pilots just go into effect. The company does not need commission approval before beginning. What the company does need is commission approval before it includes, before it gets a rate increase due to this, due to a pilot. So there is that opportunity for review. It comes on the rate side of the equation.
Okay, very good. And did I understand when I was reviewing this program that the commission in the rates already put some funding that is available for the company to use to undertake these pilots, and it's only if they're going to exceed that dollar amount and need something additional in rates that they would have to go seek that approval?
That is correct. I will also say though the $5 million that is included in the multi-year rate plan, that is what's forecasted to be included in rates. I think that, if there was information that was brought to the commission about an individual pilot, about its design that raised concern, the rates still have to be set and they still need to be just and reasonable. So you do need to look at that spending if there were any problems.
Okay, very good. And one final question that I think it'd be good to talk about now. Does the company, Green Mountain Power, have to consult also with the commission staff or the consumer advocate before they propose a pilot? You've listed a couple entities, the Vermont Energy Investment Corporation and the Renewable Energy Group in Vermont. Would they also have to talk with these other kind of usual interveners?
So the GMP does not have to consult with the commission before it develops a pilot. I don't know if they are consulting with the public advocate at the Department of Public Service beforehand. I wouldn't be surprised if they are, but it wasn't a requirement in the MOU that was signed in the case. So I guess my final answer is I'm not sure if they're consulting with the department or not.
Okay, thank you so much for your presentation today. And I'm sure some of these questions are going to linger and continue in the future as Michigan staff works on a paper about these issues. And I'm also working on a paper about these issues within NRRI. And our next presenter, as you'll soon learn, is also working on a paper on these questions. So very good presentation for us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. So we will go to our final presenter for this evening, Mr. Kappers.
Great. Thanks a lot. I really appreciate the opportunity to come speak today. What I'm going to cover in basically the next 15 minutes actually comes from about a 2.5-hour workshop presentation I've developed previously. So I'm going to move pretty fast and stay at a pretty high level. Hopefully when we get to the Q&A, we'll be able to really delve deeper into some of the issues that are raised in the deck. Next slide. So on my end, when I talk about pilots, I really mean them in sort of the most general sense possible. Pilots, as you know, we saw from Joy's slide earlier, are commonly implemented for things like rates and technology, but you can also use them to test out things like decoupling mechanisms. And I would like to believe that the comments I have today about best practices and considerations, although certainly grounded in my own experiences with rate pilots over the last 10 years, they relate to all applications of pilots. So without further ado, let's go to the next slide for my list of best practices and considerations for all types of pilots. So I believe the first task that any organization that's looking to undertake a pilot should perform is brainstorming. You really need to understand with a pretty high degree of specificity what it is you're trying to get out of the pilot. This needs to be pretty thoroughly done before you even think about starting down the path towards designing the pilot. Accordingly, you should really focus your attention on something like the following set of questions on the next slide. What do you want to learn? Why do you want to learn about that? And most importantly, how will those learnings help you with future decision making? I'd urge you to take your time with this first step in the process. All ideas at this stage really are good ideas. But what you should really strive for in the end is ultimately a set of research questions. Now, obviously, I'm a researcher and I constantly think sort of in these terms, but you all thought like this once too. Anybody remember middle school, 7th grade science class? I mean, what you're doing in a pilot is really nothing more than a glorified science experiment. Now, one of the critical steps early on in any experiment is to develop hypotheses that you're going to test. You can't test generalized concepts. You have to test specific outcomes. So for example, on the next slide, suppose a utility is thinking about implementing a default TOU rate for its residential customers in order to have it contribute, say, to resource adequacy. Well, then it'll be really important to have estimates of the peak demand reductions from customers who are facing the rate. So your first cut at a viable research question might read something like this. Do my customers reduce peak demand on a TOU rate? However, you got to ask yourself, is that really specific enough for future decision making? Because if you're really interested in resource adequacy, then you're really trying to measure, are you really trying to measure any form of peak demand? Or maybe what you need to focus on are specific types of peak demand. Likewise, will any reduction in peak demand suffice for the future decision making? Or is there really some minimum threshold below which you wouldn't move forward with a full scale rollout? So this research question, as currently posed, now seems a little bit vague. So how can we improve it? Well, let's go to the next slide. You could instead ask, do my customers reduce coincident peak demand by at least 10% on a TOU rate? All right, now we're cooking with gas. So as written, this seems sufficiently precise, right? Or is it? This question looks across all customers, but are the experiences and performance of certain subsets of customers potentially a more critical driver for future decision making? In particular, concerns have been raised in a lot of jurisdictions about the impacts of default or even voluntary TOU pricing on some of our most vulnerable customers. Notably, are they just able to respond to these types of rates? So you may want to refine this research question to focus on, say, low to moderate income customers, as their capabilities or lack thereof may actually be the ultimate deciding factor in moving ahead with default TOU. Likewise, the utility can design its TOU rate in lots of different ways. I always sort of say it's more art than science. The literature is pretty clear that the higher the price ratio, the more a customer will reduce peak period consumption. Clearly, the pilot is going to test one or maybe more specific TOU rate design, so why not reflect that in the research question? So with all that in mind, we can certainly improve and refine this research question to what we show on the next slide. Do my low to moderate income customers reduce coincident peak demand by at least 10% on a TOU rate with a 4-to-1 price ratio? Now you should really be able to focus your design efforts on the objectives that the pilot's intended to achieve in order to inform future decision making. Really, the more you can develop research questions that are sufficiently specific and link more directly to what's critical for making determinations about how to proceed, the more effective and successful your pilot will be. Next slide, please. But before we go any further, we actually now need to take a step back. Your next activity should be to see if anyone else has actually sought answers to the same or a similar set of research questions. On the next slide, we can see that it's possible, if not likely, that a lot of other utilities have gone down a similar path as the one you're envisioning. Thus, it may actually be worth spending some time reviewing what these other folks have learned and assessing if their results are sufficiently transferable to your situation. If they are, then you may decide it's just not worth spending the time and resources to pursue a similar pilot. Alternatively, you may come to the opposite conclusion, that the circumstances related to these other pilots were really sufficiently different such that you unfortunately need to move ahead with your own. So on the next slide, if you determine that you should proceed, well, then the next steps will be to prioritize all of those highly specified research questions that came out of your initial brainstorming session. Now, my guess, having gone through this a couple of times, is that you'll have generated tens, if not potentially hundreds of research questions. In my experience, that brainstorming effort is really, it can be very, very successful at getting everyone to put down their pet questions and secret burning desires for the pilot, but you clearly can't do all of them. In fact, you probably won't be able to address the vast majority of them, for if you try to, you'll probably end up not answering any of them all that well. So you'd be wise to prioritize them in order to narrow the list down substantially to only those that you want to pilot, to really focus, you want the pilot to really focus on and be designed around. To that end, you might want to assess the level of importance and urgency associated with answering each research question you come up with, as follows in the next slide. If the research question is both important and urgent to answer, well, then you should pretty obviously keep it in the pilot. As the next slide shows, though, if it's both unimportant and not urgent, well, it can clearly be dropped. Alternatively, as the next slide shows, there'll be those research questions that are important for you to answer, but may not be critically urgent. Answers can really come further down the line, so you could just put a pin in these and come back to them. These ones don't need to be a part of the pilot at this time. But the last approach, are the research questions that if you're going to answer must really be done so in the near term, but whose answers are generally kind of unimportant. So you drop these as they don't really matter in the grand scheme of your decision-making effort that the pilot will inform. Again, it's really important to reiterate that the objective of the pilot is to inform future decision-making. So if something doesn't meaningfully or substantively contribute to it, then it should be dropped from being the focus of the pilot. Next slide. So next up, you're going to need to determine what level of accuracy and precision is required to inform future decision-making. Now, in the statistical realm, these two concepts have very specific definitions and implications for the design of your study. But for our purposes today, I think it's just important to talk about them a bit more in the abstract. In general, accuracy describes the difference between the measurement, let's say in a pilot, and the actual value you would observe in the population writ large. Precision describes the variation you see when you measure the same thing repeatedly. Now, obviously, pilots are a one-time effort to measure something. If you could repeat the pilot over and over again, you'd get a much more robust sense of that variation in the results the pilot is going to produce. So accuracy and precision are really important elements associated with the design of the study, as they have some really important implications for the level of faith and trust you might have in the outcome of the pilot. Next slide, please. For some things, less accuracy and precision are far less critical for future decision making. You may only need a general sense that what you're testing works or is viable moving forward. This might be the case, say, when a pilot is focused on process or functional capabilities. For example, is the utility adequately prepared for migrating hundreds of thousands, if not millions of customers to default time-based rates, as was the case in phase 2 in the recent California pricing pilot? In other instances, it may actually be critical to robustly understand the outcomes of the pilot in order to determine whether or not the utility should move forward with full implementation of what's being tested. SMUD, as well as the California Public Utility Commission, relied heavily on the level of accuracy and precision in SMUD's pricing pilot to justify their respective transitions to default TOU for all residential customers. Clearly, though, there are cost trade-offs to be made here. The more rigorous and robust and an experimental design is that it's likely to cost more upfront in terms of design, implementation, and evaluation. But they may ultimately be cheaper over the long run, as they may provide more confidence in the outcomes. If pilots are designed to have less accuracy and precision, the outcomes realized in their full-fledged rollouts may look an awful lot different than those achieved in the pilot, resulting in lots of money being spent managing that difference. Next slide, following closely on the heels of the discussion of accuracy and precision, you're going to need to assess what level of internal and external validity is required to inform future decision-making. So on the next slide, specifically, how much do you believe that the impact you're measuring in the pilot is strictly due to the thing or things being tested? Or alternatively, are there things within or even outside the pilot that may confound the effect that you're measuring? This concept is called internal validity. The greater the internal validity of a pilot, the more you can be convinced that the impact you're measuring is caused by the intervention in the pilot and not just spuriously correlated with it. In some cases, regulators, utilities, and others may be perfectly fine with a pilot that has very weak internal validity, out of a concern that there are simply just too many things outside of the control of the utility that could affect the pilot's outcome. So you just kind of have to simply live with them. But in other cases, there may be things actually under the control of the utility which may affect or confound the results of the pilot. And those are the ones where a determination really should be made concerning whether or not they will be controlled for. For example, participation in a load management program will certainly affect the measured impact of the TOU rate during declared events. So the utility could either exclude those customers outright for participating in a rate pilot, or identify them and simply segment the customers in the analysis to differentially estimate response during declared events. Excuse me. On the next slide, talk about another important issue, and this one has to do with how well you can extrapolate the results of the pilot to individuals or circumstances not included in the pilot. For example, if a pilot includes a piece of enabling technology that's offered for free to participants, do the results of the pilot adequately reflect uptake if the customer will eventually be required to pay for some share or all of that piece of technology? So this concept is called external validity. The greater the external validity of a pilot, the more you can be convinced that the results you observe in the pilot can be generalized and extended beyond it. In some cases, this may be something that must simply just be accepted. For example, many pilots that test time-based rate designs have been implemented in areas where advanced meters have first been installed. These areas may not have been overly representative of the broader utility service territory, or may not have been overly representative of the target customer segments that the research questions are most focused on. Again, say low to moderate income customers. A simple awareness of the limitations of the pilot may be sufficient, but in other cases, it may actually be imperative to alter elements of the pilot itself to ensure sufficient external validity is achieved. Next slide. In the penultimate best practice, and in my humble opinion, really the most important one, is that the design of the pilot needs to be done concurrent with a plan for how it's going to be evaluated. Next slide. Your decisions on the issues raised up to this point should lead you to the appropriate design for your pilot. However, that design will directly determine what evaluation techniques you'll need to employ to derive the outcomes of your pilot. So it's really critical to develop the evaluation plan at the same time that you're determining the design of your pilot. On the next slide, this way you can verify the various data needs for the subsequent evaluation and put in place processes and procedures for collecting, storing, and accessing this data at the appropriate time. The level of complexity associated with such a task cannot be understated. So before your pilot ever gets into the field, you should have a very clear assessment of what data is needed and how it's going to be collected and stored, and that needs to be a part of that evaluation plan. Last but not least, on the next slide, you should really spend some time anticipating problems your pilot's going to encounter. As the next slide shows, Murphy's Law is going to be in full effect. Lots of pilots have had to be delayed or even canceled, or the results of which have been substantially undermined due to problems that were encountered throughout its implementation. Some of those problems could have been avoided outright with sufficient planning ahead of time, while others could have at least been mitigated if contingency plans had been developed during the planning phase of the pilot. You can obviously spend way too much time contemplating all the what-ifs, but any amount of time dedicated to anticipating problems and developing answers will easily pay dividends down the road for you. So with that, I think my 15 minutes is basically up. So thanks for listening, and I'm really looking forward to the questions that come.
Thank you, Peter. That was very succinct, especially if the entire presentation there was 2 hours. We have a number of great questions, so I will open this up certainly for anyone here to any one of our panelists to be able to answer. The first question that has come in, they would love to know whether there has been any research done in regards to pilots as it relates to the differences between IOUs and municipal-owned utilities, and I think we could add co-ops in there as well. Are there differences between how pilots are implemented and how are they performed with these different or within these different entities?
This is Joy. For the review that we conducted, we just focused on electric IOUs within Michigan. We actually don't have data on the munis and co-ops to make a determination on their pilots without sending out some type of survey. So for the information that our work group is looking at currently, we have just focused on IOUs, but perhaps some of the other panelists might have more information.
And this is Tom Stanton.
This is Pete.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, go
you
on.
go first.
Okay. I'm probably going to say the same thing as you. You know, on a national level, I'm not aware of any analysis that has done segmentation on results of pilots from IOUs to MOUs. I know that Dr. Ahmad Faruqi from the Brattle Group, as well as some colleagues of his, Sanam Sargesi and some other folks, have written a couple of different papers over the last 5 to 10 years at different points that seek to synthesize the results of both domestic and international pilots. I think at this point he's got well over like 150 or almost close to 200 pilots in that database. I don't recall if he has ever segmented those results by IOUs, munis, or co-ops. But that's the only place, at least in a rate pilot standpoint, that I could think that information might exist.
And I think Dr. Faruqi presented recently to the Michigan My Power Grid group and said now he's got 340 different pilot programs in his database. I think you're right that maybe no one's ever asked this explicit question. It's not a bad question to ask. Maybe we'll be able to find something about that as we dig into this question some more in the near future. I was going to suggest that it's possible that the energy program evaluators around the country might have more answers to this question, and also suggest that it may be more of a difference in utility size and resources between big and small. That might make a much bigger difference than who's the owners.
Well, we have another question, one that is very pertinent to us here in Michigan. If the goal of a pilot is to provide results that can be generalized in a future period, how should commissions handle a pilot that is currently running in a period that may not mirror future conditions? And they're talking about that period being many states implementing stay-at-home orders related to the public health crisis, and how the shift in demand may not, at this current time, may not mirror future conditions. And I think from our standpoint, certainly any examples on how other commissions are approaching this question of evaluating and analyzing ongoing pilots during this time period, we'd certainly like to hear thoughts from any of the panelists on that.
This is Pete from LBL. On the one hand, I think there's just an element of, you know, unlike the past, let's say 20, 30, 40 years of rate pilots, again, that's my very specific experience and knowledge base. One could say, you know, there's been periods of recessions and other exogenous factors that may affect to some degree sort of the external validity, is sort of use a term I raised in my presentation, of the results of pilots. In a general sense, there was sort of an expectation that, well, at some point, you know, load's going to come back at a particular growth rate. And so we've never sort of felt like there's a seismic or structural change in the economy, or a seismic or structural change in the broader sort of communities that we live in and work in and operate in. I think, as we all have kind of seen, I think a lot of us are questioning that right now, and how systematic are things going to be different, whether it's just over the next 6 months to a year, or whether it's going to be over the next 5 years. And so I think it's really challenging. This is a great question, one I definitely don't have any good answers to, of who knows what the future is going to look like. And so, you know, you kind of have to take with a grain of salt the results that you're getting right now from pilots in the field, and just acknowledge the fact that things may look awfully different, you know, 6 months, a year, 2 years, 5 years from now, and just have to kind of play it by ear and be adaptive. I think that's one of the big words of the day, you know, for the last month or two, is we just have to adapt, you know. And I know I'm not in a position of a commission or a staff, you know, in directing where lots of money is being approved. I'm simply a, you know, researcher in an ivory tower. But I think that's going to have to be a critical component of these decisions going forward, is this willingness to kind of be flexible and adaptive. And I think the system in Vermont that was talked about lends itself substantially to that sort of ability for that adaptability.
Any other thoughts on this question from our panelists? The next question that we have here, and I believe this is from our two earlier presentations, was the pilot funding sources solely from customers through base rates, through surcharges, or were there other sources of funding that were used to initiate those pilots?
This is Joy. Oh, go ahead, Jake.
Oh, thank you, Joy. I think it depends on the pilot. Some of the pilots that GMP has undertaken generate their own revenue from participating customers. So an example would be their energy storage system pilot. The participating customers paid a lease payment to GMP to use those batteries. So some of the funding for that pilot came directly from participating customers, but then there also was a capital component because GMP had to purchase those batteries. So that was, a base rate component. So I think the funding can come from multiple sources depending on the pilot and what technology you're using.
This is Joy. Yeah, I agree with Jake that pilot funding can come from a variety of sources. We do see a large number that come from rate base in Michigan, but there have been cases where they've received government grant funding to help support pilot projects within Michigan too.
Yeah, I'll just add on top of that, there's certainly federal government opportunities to support pilots. I believe there's a number of funding opportunity announcements that come out of different DOE offices. I know the Building Technologies Office, I believe, is looking to put one out soon on connected communities. Looking for utility partners, technology partners. I believe there's a cost share expectation, but certainly that is an additional source of revenue to cover, additional source of revenue to cover the costs of these types of pilots.
Thank you. Our next question here, how often do you find that current value or the average value isn't nearly as important as the change in the value that can be examined in a test pilot? How many pilot programs fail by asking the wrong question or measuring the wrong data? How do you help people get pilot design right before data are measured?
I'll take a crack at that one. That seems maybe, and then love to hear from Jake and or Joy in terms of some of the on the ground stuff. So 3 questions there. How do you find the current value or average value, and it's not nearly as important in the change? So part of that, I suppose, can be in the design of the study. I hope I answer this question right. I know it's a little hard in these this type of a circumstance to ask a question and then have the answer sort of not totally know exactly what you're asking about. But there are certain designs of studies that look at what's called a pretreatment period. And so they collect data and use data to sort of condition what they're seeing during the pilot itself. This can be done in part just to kind of capture differences from one year to the next, from weather or things like that that might affect load, as just one example, but it helps you kind of develop what I guess you could call as sort of a baseline. If you do this within sort of a randomized experiment, you're collecting that data for both treatment and control customers. So you're using this to sort of acknowledge the fact that there may be some starting differences between these two groups, and then you can more accurately assess the change associated with what you're implementing or testing in a pilot. So I think that potentially answers sort of both of those questions. How many pilot programs fail by asking the wrong question or measuring the wrong data? Oh man, I can't tell you the number of that. I mean, I don't think it's not a ton, but I oftentimes think the wrong question is oftentimes what the pilot is designed to achieve, but it isn't necessarily the thing that is going to drive your future decision. It's either the simplest thing to measure, it's the one that sort of comes first and foremost, it's something that has been anchored on by certain individuals, but it may not necessarily be the thing that drives the decision, process going forward. And not collecting data correctly, I can give you countless examples. I'll do a very quick one. One of the pilots that I know of basically lost the data associated with who initially was assigned to receive what treatment. Ultimately, some of the technology that was being implemented as part of a pilot couldn't actually be implemented by certain customers because they just didn't have the capability. It was like an AC switch and they didn't have an AC unit. And so by losing sort of the initial assignment, it messed up the evaluation that came afterwards. It didn't undermine the pilot completely, but it wasn't in line with the design of the pilot, so they had to really scramble to get the evaluation to work correctly given the implementation and the data that was ultimately available. And then how do you help people get pilot design right before data are measured? You have to spend the time up front doing it. Again, I can't tell you the number of pilots I've seen where I feel like people figure out the data requirements well after you've started, and at that point, maybe you need some starting information from folks when they're enrolling, right? That's your chance to get some demographic information from every single customer. So you potentially miss opportunities to get the right data if you don't think about it at the time of the design. Again, that's why I really advocate for this concept of linking design and evaluation.
Any other thoughts on those questions from our panelists?
Yeah, this is Joy. In the Energy Programs and Technology Pilots work group, I feel like we're grappling with many of these questions, actually. Mm-hmm. And for any of you guys who are interested, you know, we are undergoing that stakeholder process right now, and we're doing webinars, so anyone can participate and listen into the speakers we're bringing in if you're interested. But in terms of some of the speakers we've heard thus far, we've heard from utilities and people who conduct pilots for their technologies. And what we've heard is that a lot of them like to have flexibility when they're conducting these pilots, so that if they find something surprising as a pilot is moving forward, they want the flexibility to be able to change some of the questions that they might be asking or the end result that they're actually seeking. So they want to have the agility to pivot and to redirect the pilot to realize the most benefit. And that's really challenging when you're trying to think about encouraging utilities to design the pilot right at the get-go, because at the same time, we're hearing from stakeholders and utilities that there's this need to be agile and to be able to be flexible, that as you learn as the pilot is going on, that should there be major problems, that you don't have to wait until the conclusion of the pilot to make those changes, but that maybe you could make them midway. So I think these are really great questions, and it's not something that I have an answer to, but it is something that we're exploring in our work group.
I agree with everything the other panelists have said, and I would add that as regulators, I think the job of commissions is to ask questions and to educate themselves, you know, by attending things like these webinars to sort of understand, you know, what are the problems that the utilities are trying to investigate, and if the commission is asking questions and probing the reasoning behind the pilots, then it's taking, I think the commission's taking a first step to avoiding mistakes.
Thank you, and it may be possible, Tom, to send out to participants on this call links to some of the past webinars that Joy has been leading related to the My Power Grid effort and the Energy and Tech Pilots working group there. Also, Joy, you may want to just quickly discuss the report that the Commission and your staff are producing in regards to this section of the My Power Grid effort. And because of the interruptions in our stakeholder group meetings related to COVID-19, we've actually pushed our reporting deadline back by several months. But maybe if you want to briefly talk about some of the outlines in that report and what you all are looking to compile.
Yeah, so earlier in my presentation, I listed some of the tasks that we were given by the Commission, and staff will produce a report to cover those tasks and describe the stakeholder process that we're currently undergoing right now, to describe the best practices that we're seeing not only in the US but hopefully nationally in regards to utility pilots, and some of our recommendations on the criteria that should be used to evaluate pilots moving forward. So we've been really fortunate to have a variety of really great experts to come and present in person when we could do that a few months ago, and now on the webinars to share their expertise with us about what they've seen. So we've had Dr. Faruqi, which Tom mentioned earlier. He was there with us via the web 2 weeks ago. And we've had presenters from LBNL also. So we had just a really great number of experts to share their thoughts on what criteria should be used and what some of the best practices are. We've also had a variety of general stakeholders who have experience in the area share their information. So in the staff report, which has now been pushed back to September 30th for the deadline, we will be summarizing all of those findings and hopefully make some recommendations from staff as to what we believe are the criteria that we could consider moving forward.
Thank you very much. And I believe Tom has sent a message to everyone with a link on how to register to take part in those working group sessions. And that will also lead you to some of our past webinars and discussions. We have another question, a follow-up question related to COVID-19. Is it worth it to continue devoting money and resources to pilots currently in the field at present during the public health crisis?
This is Pete from LBL. I suppose the real issue is what's the cost, right? Yes, you are definitely going to get different results to those pilots than you had originally envisioned. But again, going back to something I said earlier, what we're going through now may sort of be what the world looks like for some time going forward. It's not clear how long that'll be. So canceling pilots, certainly I think that's something, commissions and staff and utilities should consider, but there's obviously a cost associated with that. And so it's really that sort of trade-off of the unknown, right? So I think it's something that certainly should be on the table and discussed, but each jurisdiction is certainly going to decide for themselves whether that's appropriate and under what conditions.
This is Tom. I think you're exactly right, Peter. And I think this is also one of those many, many questions for regulators that looks at the difference between fixed costs and variable costs. A lot of what goes into making a pilot program is the fixed cost of doing everything involved in finding the design. And then the variable cost might, adjust up and down depending on participation over time. So it could be that we create a pause in an existing pilot, and that pause could happen just because right now it's so hard to get the attention of any customers to participate. Later on, when the COVID emergency is over and we all start to return to whatever the new normal will be, then maybe the pilot would pick back up on itself. So there might not be as much funding at risk in the short term as it would first appear. It's not, you can't look at a $2 million pilot program and think, oh my gosh, we better stop it now because we're going to save $2 million. It may be that a whole bunch of it is going to be fixed costs that have to go into the design and the evaluation.
Thank you. And this may be one of our last questions of the afternoon here, but this is a topic that we were all discussing during one of our organizing calls, and I know is one of the central topics or questions for our effort here in Michigan. But if all the panelists can kind of just give their thoughts on how do you determine when a pilot for a certain utility is not necessary, and how do you determine whether the results of a similar pilot conducted in another state or in another region or by another utility is satisfactory for being able to scale that effort or that project or that technology up for your utility? So any thoughts there on that question, and just on kind of how do you evaluate on the front end whether a pilot is necessary or not?
This is Joy. So at the last stakeholder meeting that we had for the work group, we had Dr. Faruqi talk, and he actually talked about time of use rate pilots, and he mentioned 4 generations of time of use pilots starting in 1975 through present day. And his point was that or my takeaway from his presentation was that even though there have been so many time of use pilots conducted over decades, and even though we apparently have enough information to be able to predict the outcome of a time of use pilot, there's still this need from utilities and commissions to understand how they can adapt that technology or innovation for their jurisdiction and for their service area. And even if it's not a question of whether that specific innovation works, there still might be a need to test how it works within the utility's own maybe IT system or their general infrastructure. So I think it's a really difficult question to answer, and it's something that we're trying to wrap our heads around in the work group. But it's definitely a very important one to try to get a better handle on.
I think to follow on, or maybe add to what Joy just said. That's, I think, where if you do this, if you undertake the effort to sort of see what other people have done, and in an ideal world, try and gain some sense of how good of a pilot was it? Was it designed well? Some of the issues I talked about accuracy, precision, internal validity, external validity, those things are really going to help a commission, a staff, stakeholders, at least understand if the results that other people have found, how much do you believe them? Do they apply to your circumstance? Is sort of the two, I think, critical things to think about. And so, yeah, as Dr. Faruqi said, in the rates area, we've done this stuff for, my entire lifetime since I was born in 1975. But that doesn't mean you wouldn't, you might still want to do a pilot, but not because you're trying to validate the load impacts. I think I would agree with Dr. Faruqi that in that particular narrow focus, like this is something we've done a lot of work in and we have a pretty good, robust understanding of. But as Joy mentioned, maybe what you're really trying to do is focus on the process side of things, and that's what you're really piloting. So I don't think it's necessary. I think that's the critical issue here, is not just that piloting this thing that's already been piloted is necessarily bad. It's what are you uniquely trying to learn that others have not? Because if you can't really come up with the uniqueness, then yeah, you should be fine with what other people have done. Or and the uniqueness could very well be my systems have to work to do this, and that's really what I'm testing.
In Vermont, we have not seen any, to my knowledge, pilots about time of use rates or anything like that. So I'll confess that I think it's been assumed that a lot of what's being piloted is novel and that there aren't great examples to look to, but I appreciate that point, and it's certainly something that I think we'll be looking at in the future. We have had a situation where GMP proposed several pilots that revolved around battery use. And I think there was some concern raised by stakeholders about, was the company putting too much of its eggs in one basket with the batteries? But the company also did advance a rationale that it was actually testing different use cases of the batteries and of the technologies. So while the pilots may have superficially appeared similar, they were testing different things. So it's a good question, and definitely something I'm going to take back to our shop and mull over.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone, this afternoon. I will go ahead and pass things back to Tom. I know that we had a lot of questions this afternoon in regards to COVID-19, and it sounds like there's going to be several great webinars coming up on the impacts of this public health crisis on utility rate making.
Okay, thank you so much, Commissioner, and thank you to all the presenters. I think we had a really, really productive webinar today, and it will help a lot of us think through these questions. I know there'll be more discussion in the future, and I want to thank the audience. I see almost all of you still there on the line, so we really appreciate your attendance today. Notice on the screen right now, we're announcing this new 3-webinar series explicitly about COVID-19 and how it relates to utility rate making issues. We know this is of the utmost importance all over the country. We're working with the NRRI staff subcommittee on accounting and finance, and you'll see that these are being scheduled every 2 weeks on Wednesdays coming up. So mark your calendar for those. You can register at our NRRI.org website. If you don't see the registration there today, it'll be up there shortly. And again, we want to thank everyone for your participation today and look forward to working with you again in the future. Bye now.